The mountains do not forgive. They do not forget. They hold their dead in silence, and they're living in chains of fear. And if you think the Appalachians are just ridges of old rock, softened by time and fog, you are already wrong. For beneath those green folds lies something older than any American history, something that has been whispered about but never written honestly. Men who cut timber here swore the trees bled sap as dark as blood. Hunters told of shadows that moved without animals. And in the hollows, those deep, hidden valleys where the sunlight dies before evening, there were women who carried names no preacher dared speak. Witches. Not the storybook kind, but the kind who bound families in oaths, who cursed whole bloodlines, who made bargains with things that were never human. The people who stayed here learned not to speak of them. They locked their doors at sundown, scratched hex signs into their barns, and burned salt at the edges of their land. Outsiders thought it was folklore, but folklore is just the language the guilty use when they want to laugh at truths they don't understand. The truth was darker, heavier, dangerous to carry in the mind too long. Because the witches of the Appalachian Dark Mountains were not just healers or herbalists, they were wardens of something. And men who stumbled too close to them often vanished, their names scratched off county ledgers like they had never lived. Ask the old men who worked the coal seams in Kentucky. Ask the widows who still sweep the dust off graves in Tennessee. They'll tell you, quietly, that whole families were eaten alive by curses that began with a single woman's whisper, and that the line between folklore and history is thinner here than anywhere else in America. You want to know the truth? Good. But understand this. Once I take you inside these mountains, once I open the door to the old oaths and the black rituals that still echo here, you cannot shut it again. Your sleep won't be yours anymore. You'll start to hear the woods breathe. You'll start to see shapes at the tree line. That's not superstition. That's memory. Because the mountains remember every scream. Now listen carefully. I'm going to tell you about the witches who ruled the dark veins of Appalachia. The ones who turned families into offerings, who carved secrets into bone, and whose curses never die, only wait. The first record of them isn't in books. It's in the silence of the people who lived here, a silence that outlasted generations. But if you dig hard enough, you find fragments scorched at the edges, written in the margins of county ledgers, and in the broken handwriting of preachers who were terrified but forced to write something down. One such fragment, dated 1821 in a hollow outside Boone County, speaks of the women of the Black Ridge, who gathered by a crooked oak to bind the tongue of a man who would not be silent. That man's name was John Tanner, a land surveyor who vanished without trace while marking parcels for settlement. His tools were found in the creek, rusted but arranged with deliberate care, as though someone wanted to mock the searchers. A week later his horse returned, ribs showing, its mane hacked away in patches like offerings. No charges, no arrests, just the whispers that Tanner had crossed the women who kept the old ways. His disappearance was marked as lost in wilderness, but the locals knew. They always knew. These witches weren't the kind that advertised themselves in fire and brimstone. They were far more dangerous. They blended in, widows and midwives, quiet daughters who never left their cabins, faces you'd pass in town and forget, until you crossed them. Then your livestock would rot from the inside, your child would wake screaming night after night until they didn't wake at all, or your body would be found stiff and pale in the morning dew, lips blackened as though you had drunk poison in your sleep. And always, always, the mountains would cover for them. Because the forest grows back fast, erasing footprints. The creeks rise suddenly, washing away evidence. And the people themselves close their mouths, because in Appalachia, silence is survival. The witches knew this. They thrived on it. They became the mountain's secret keepers, feared, but never named, their bloodlines hidden in plain sight. And the deeper you trace those lines, the more you see the same surnames appear again and again in tragedies the county clerks couldn't explain. You think you're listening to folklore, But folklore is only history that no one dared to record properly. This isn't superstition, it's inheritance. A system of control woven into the very soil of Appalachia, where curses are not stories, they are contracts, and every contract demands payment, even if it takes a century to collect. The deeper you look, the more you realize these weren't isolated tales, but a pattern, a rhythm of vanishing, of sickness, of ruin that always circled back to the same hills, the same hollowed farms, the same names whispered in half-broken hymns at funerals. In 1837, when the cholera wave swept through Kentucky, Boone County's ridge country reported fewer deaths than anywhere else, but the ones who did die, always men, always outsiders, were found with their faces contorted, as if they had seen something that pulled their last breath from them in terror. Farmers traveling through the ridges told of lanterns burning deep in the woods at hours no God-fearing woman should have been awake, of figures moving in a circle, white shawls flashing in the moonlight like ghostly banners, and a low humming sound that made their horses freeze in place. By the time the men stumbled home, the lanterns had vanished, the woods quiet again, as if mocking the idea that anything had been there at all. And yet, the county register shows an uncanny coincidence. Families who had traded land, livestock, or favors with certain women survived the plague untouched, while their neighbors died in clusters. No one wrote the word witch in those ledgers, but the silence between the lines is louder than any accusation. You see it in the way pastors stopped visiting the ridge altogether, choosing to preach that God's house is in the valley, rather than confront the crooked paths leading upward. You see it in how juries refused to indict when disappearances became too blatant, knowing full well the price of pointing a finger. And you see it in the unmarked graves, scattered like warning stones along creek beds and beneath sagging barns, graves that families quietly tended but never claimed aloud. These women had learned something vital, that in America the law can be bent, the church ignored, but fear holds a community together tighter than any chain. Their power wasn't in fire, wasn't in spells carved into wood. It was in the hush, the glance, the unspoken understanding that they could take everything from you if they chose. And once you recognize that pattern, it's impossible not to feel it breathing through the soil of Appalachia, even now, waiting for the right moment to remind us that their bargains never ended, they were only paused. By 1841, the pattern was no longer rumor, but a shadow stamped into the ridge's very identity, for while the rest of Kentucky bent itself toward progress, railroads stretching, mills clattering, schools sprouting in valley towns, the ridges seemed frozen, locked in a stubborn time where crops failed only for strangers, where livestock sickened only in the hands of men who mocked or defied the women of the hills, and where whole families who dared to move away were found within a year returning broken, bankrupt, and hollow-eyed, muttering about whispers that followed them even in distant counties. One case became infamous, though never printed in official papers. The Callahan brothers, young loggers who swore in a tavern they would drag the ridge women to court and see them hanged, vanished during a storm. Their axes later discovered planted in the roots of a lightning-struck oak as though offered up in ritual. Their widowed mother claimed to hear their voices in the wind whenever she crossed the county line, begging her to return to the ridge and not resist the pull. And so she did, building a shanty near the very oak where the axes had been left, and from then on she was seen carrying baskets of food to gatherings deep in the woods at night, her shawl pulled tight, though no weather called for it. Outsiders branded it madness, yet no one from Boone County ever laughed. They knew it was the price of survival, the invisible economy of obedience that the ridge demanded. The witches, if you dare call them that, never paraded their power in open daylight, never scrawled threats in blood or cursed men from the pulpit. Instead, they thrived on subtler forms of dominance, a withheld glance at market, a loaf of bread placed on a doorstep when a child grew sick, a whispered name uttered into the rafters of a barn that meant either protection or ruin, depending on how you had treated. them. This was not spectacle, but governance. And it endured precisely because it remained beneath the surface, woven into marriages, inheritances, land deeds, and sermons left unfinished. By then, the ridges were less a place than a net, woven not of rope or steel, but of favors, debts, secrets, and silences, binding every man who breathed its air. And if you've ever wondered why certain parts of Appalachia never yielded to railroads or industry, why men still swear the woods hold things best left unnamed, it is because this net was never cut, only stretched thinner with time, so that even now to speak too openly of the ridge women is to risk feeling it tighten suddenly around your throat. The most whispered of those vanished families were the Marrows, a name that once carried weight across Boone County for their skill in carpentry and their fierce independence until the ridge took notice and marked them for its lesson. In the summer of 1843, Eliza Marrow, a mother of 3, was overheard in town saying she would sooner trust a rattlesnake than the women who played at herbs and mutterings, and within a fortnight her household began to unravel. Her youngest fell ill with a fever no doctor could name, her husband's sawmill burned in a night without thunder, and neighbors claimed they saw Eliza herself wandering barefoot along the ridge trail, her eyes glazed as though listening to someone who wasn't there, whispering words she would never confess aloud. One evening, she and the children vanished. The house left unlocked, supper still cooling on the table, and when search parties combed the woods, all they found were strange lattice-works of sticks hanging from the trees in patterns no woodsman recognized, as if a map had been scrawled in the air itself. The official record says Eliza and Ruth Marrow simply vanished, swallowed by the mountains the way so many names are, but the ridge kept its own account, and for years afterward men swore they saw the girls standing at the edge of cornfields, silent, pale, their dresses unchanged, watching the plows drag through the earth as though waiting for someone to acknowledge them. One farmer claimed he offered them bread only for the girls to vanish the moment he drew close, leaving behind footprints that pressed inches into the soil, though the ground was dry. Yet what made the Marrows' tale more than a local ghost story was the change it wrought in those who had once mocked the ridge women. Merchants began giving discounts quietly when the women shopped. Ministers paused their sermons if one entered late, and juries excused themselves from any case that might displease them, as if the law itself had grown wise enough to bend. The Marrow disappearance was not tragedy, it was demonstration, a warning written in absence, teaching the county that land, faith, and livelihood belonged not to the men who chopped trees and built barns, but to the unseen tribunal of women who, with nothing but silence and suggestion, could erase a family from memory. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this: no Marrow descendant exists on record after that summer. No bloodline survived, as though the ridge had not only taken the family, but erased their seed, ensuring that defiance would never again sprout in their name. If the Marrow family's erasure had taught the farmers fear, it was the bending of the church that revealed the ridge's true dominion, for nothing spoke louder in Boone County than Sunday sermons, and yet even the pulpit could not shield itself once the whispers grew thick. The First Baptist Church of Ash Hollow had stood for 40 years, a place where men in stiff collars preached salvation and condemned witchcraft as the devil's snare. But one evening in 1845, during a revival meant to cleanse the county of ungodly superstition, the visiting preacher collapsed mid-sermon, his voice strangled on a word he never finished, his hands clawing the air as though choking on smoke invisible to everyone else, and when his body hit the floorboards, the congregation swore they smelled crushed sage and bitter roots rising through the rafters. The elders declared it a seizure, a judgment of God, but the townspeople remembered the way a ridge woman, old Nancy Keel, wrapped in shawls and silence, had sat in the back pew that night, her head tilted just enough to watch the pulpit like a hawk studies a mouse, and none missed that she left before the preacher's body was carried out. From that night on, the church changed. Ministers stopped naming the witches in sermons, prayer meetings shifted from fire and brimstone to hushed devotions, and whenever a ridge woman crossed the threshold of the sanctuary, hymns faltered and voices sank, as though some deeper liturgy had entered the room. There were nights, too, when the bell tolled without a hand pulling the rope, deep in the fog, summoning no one and warning everyone, and when men climbed the tower they found not bats or pranksters, but bundles of herbs tucked into the rafters, wormwood, yarrow, bloodroot, knotted with twine that no one dared untie. Some say the church became less a house of God than a vestibule where two altars coexisted, one visible, one hidden, the official preaching salvation while the other demanded respect for the ridge. It was then that a new order took hold in Boone County. The law of the state and the law of the Bible carried weight, but higher still was the law of the ridge, unspoken, unquestioned, enforced not with fire, but with disappearance, not with shackles, but with silence. And it was this order that gave the witches a power no gallows could ever break, an empire of suggestion binding both the soul and the land itself. Commerce, the one force that might have challenged the ridge women, soon bowed as quietly and completely as the church, for even in Boone County's markets, where men prided themselves on deals and ledgers, the unseen hand of the ridge dictated who prospered and who failed. Merchants would arrive with wagons of goods only to find customers vanishing inexplicably, deals collapsing for no reason, or payments mysteriously returned with notes of apology scrawled in unfamiliar hand, warning that certain trades were forbidden and no one dared ask who enforced it. One blacksmith, proud and obstinate, refused to honor a warning and found his horses stolen overnight, the tracks leading straight into the mountains, returning only days later with their heads bowed, bridled, yet carrying no sign of who had taken them, and the smith's forge cooled, his fire extinguished as if the bellows themselves had been cursed. Traders whispered of seeing white figures at the edges of roads, shaping shadows with hands that could twist luck itself, and of hearing the faint, rhythmic tapping of sticks on hollow logs deep in the forest that marked the passage of judgment. Even money, the most tangible token of human trust, would disappear from tills, not through theft, but through impossibility. Coins gone, notes shredded, ledgers miswritten, with auditors baffled and trembling before accounts that reconciled themselves in impossible ways. Families who dared to move wealth from the ridge found it diminished mysteriously, livestock lost, barns damaged, and always a message left in silence. The ridge sees, the ridge decides. And yet, there was a method, not madness, a code that only the women understood, a network of observation, patience, and ritual that turned fear into compliance, whispered knowledge into law, and obedience into survival. By the late 1840s, Boone County's economy was a testament not to industriousness or enterprise, but to submission, a careful dance where no man, no preacher, no merchant, and no official dared to disrupt the quiet governance of women who required nothing but attention and acknowledgement, and in doing so commanded every aspect of life from seed to harvest, from birth to death, from ledger to grave. It was a dominion, invisible yet absolute, and once you recognize it, you realize how the ridge itself became both battlefield and throne room, and how those who failed to see it were quietly erased, leaving only whispers and warning in their place. For the families who dared defiance, life on the ridge became a slow unraveling of certainty, a descent into an invisible siege where every step, every choice was observed and weighed, and consequences arrived like shadows before the sun itself disappeared. The Carters, a farming family with 3 sons, believed themselves clever enough to skirt the ridge's influence, building a barn slightly off the prescribed line of property, storing corn in a loft no woman had sanctioned. And yet one morning they awoke to find the roof caved inward, not from snow or rot, but as if the timbers themselves had been instructed to collapse, leaving the family scrambling amid splintered boards, while a circle of sticks, faintly carved with symbols no outsider could read, marked the yard where the collapse had begun. Their youngest son, Samuel, fell sick immediately afterward, a fever no medicine could temper, and neighbors reported seeing a pale figure standing at the edge of the field, a shawl flapping in the wind, whispering to the trees as though issuing commands that reached the boy through the air itself. By the third week, the carter's eldest attempted to confront the women, walking the ridge trails under the high sun with axe in hand and bravado in heart, only to return at night, silent, with hair damp, eyes wide, and no memory of the hours he had spent. His hands bore scratches no brush or tree could have made, and the rest of the family understood that their challenge had not gone unnoticed. Over time, the carters withdrew from social gatherings, no longer venturing beyond the ridge for markets, church, or court, their life reduced to tending the fields along invisible lines, obeying rules they had never been told aloud, performing acts of submission they did not understand, all under the silent gaze of women whose power needed neither proclamation nor witness. And it was here, in these invisible dominions of observation, manipulation, and slow terror, that the true force of the ridge became apparent. The women's control was psychological, meticulous, and absolute, capable of bending minds, bodies, and entire families without ever touching them directly, ensuring that resistance not only failed, but became a form of punishment in itself, embedding obedience in the marrow of those who survived to tell whispers rather than stories, leaving the rest to vanish without record, a warning carved into the history of the hills themselves. Beneath the surface of fear and obedience, the ridge women maintained rituals older than memory itself, acts of quiet devotion and meticulous preparation that intertwined superstition, folklore, and what outsiders could only call magic, though the women never admitted it aloud. In the dead of night, they would move through the hollows, carrying bundles of roots, animal bones, and dried herbs, arranging them in patterns that followed the land's natural lines, whispering names, dates, and promises into the wind, as though speaking directly to the unseen forces that lingered in the soil, trees, and streams, and those who glimpsed these movements swore they seemed to bend reality itself. The mist would shift, animals would freeze mid-step, and distant thunder would rumble without storm. Some nights, small effigies, dolls carved from wood and dressed in remnants of the sisters' own clothing, were placed carefully along ridge paths, each one a marker, a talisman, a reminder of the unseen court that watched every footstep. The dolls were never merely symbolic, for those who ignored them or treated them with disrespect found themselves beset by unexplainable accidents, barns collapsing, wells running dry, livestock vanishing, or sudden illnesses striking children, as if the ridge itself had invoked judgment. Folklore spread quietly among families, passed in whispers by those who had survived encounters, tales of women who could speak to the mountains, summon storms, or call forth silence from the air, all while remaining unseen, hidden behind the illusion of isolation and age. Outsiders who attempted to document these occurrences often left the county abruptly, plagued by nightmares, fever, or a sudden irrational sense of urgency to leave, their journals containing sketches of effigies, cryptic notes, and warnings that were later dismissed as fanciful or imagined. Yet the ridge never lied, and those who stayed, however skeptical, soon learned that survival required acknowledgement, ritual, and compliance to an order that was older than law, older than church, older even than memory. It was through these nightly acts, repeated with precision and silence, that the ridge women carved an authority not through brute force, but through the slow, creeping realization in every family, merchant, and minister. To disobey was to risk erasure, to witness was to inherit a burden, and to speak recklessly was to invite the mountain itself to judge. By the time the Walker sisters came of age in the early 1900s, the lessons of the ridge had been etched into their blood and memory, a lineage of control, ritual, and calculated fear stretching back generations. And they inherited not just a homestead, but a code older than the county itself, a system for bending neighbors, lawmen, and the land to their will without leaving a mark. Louisa, Haiti, and Martha were raised on whispered histories of vanished families like the Marrows, instructed in the subtle arts of observation and influence, and schooled in the consequences of breaking silence, taught that a wrong word or glance could undo an entire lifetime of survival. The sisters moved through Y Hollow with the patience of predators, marking every pattern in the wind, noting every footfall in the soil, cataloging the habits and weaknesses of those who ventured too close, and employing the dolls, herbs, and secret gestures passed down from their mother as both memory and warning, a system of checks and balances that kept outsiders guessing and the family protected. Their homestead became a nexus of power, a focal point where tradition, superstition, and unspoken law converged, and locals quickly learned that their behavior could be influenced without a word, simply by witnessing the sisters' actions, the careful placement of objects, or the subtle alignment of crops and fires in patterns no casual observer could interpret. Even the county sheriff, who visited monthly, was compelled to honor unspoken rules, checking the Walker property not only as duty, but in silent acknowledgement of the power the sisters wielded, a power derived from the mountain itself, refined over decades, and enforced through fear, ritual, and psychological mastery. When outsiders like James Blackwood arrived, the sisters met curiosity with precision, offering enough knowledge to satisfy immediate questions, but withholding the truths that could unravel their careful dominion, for they understood that power was most secure when it was invisible, a weight on the psyche rather than a visible threat, and that those who sought the truth too boldly risked the same erasure that had claimed families before them, a quiet, relentless correction administered not through violence, but through fear, manipulation, and the immutable laws of the ridge, ensuring that the Walker sisters remained untouchable, their secrets intact, and their authority unchallenged, as the mountains themselves watched and whispered along every hollow and ridge line. When James Blackwood first set foot in Y Hollow, he was unaware that he had crossed an invisible threshold, that the homestead he saw, weathered logs, neat gardens, and the three elderly sisters moving with quiet precision, was a stage set for the enforcement of decades of psychological control and whispered terror. At first, he approached with the detached curiosity of a folklorist, tape recorder in hand, notebook ready, convinced that he was documenting quaint mountain traditions, unaware that every question he asked, every step he took, had already been anticipated and weighed. Louisa's eyes, sharp and cold, measured him like prey from the moment he arrived, while Hetty and Martha mirrored her vigilance with subtle gestures, hands brushing a doll here, a bundle of herbs there, small, almost imperceptible signals that conveyed centuries of accumulated knowledge and authority. Inside the cabin, the air was heavy with both civility and unspoken threat, the fire flickering shadows across walls that contained secrets older than the county records he intended to consult. When he inquired about the dolls on the mantel, their simple wooden forms suddenly became an instrument of tension, 6 figures representing not only sisters lost to time, but an unbroken chain of promises, oaths, and warnings that Blackwood could not yet comprehend. Each answer the sisters gave was precise, careful, yet laced with a subtle weight of control, enough information to appear cooperative, but never enough to penetrate the core of their power. Even as he left, the impression of being observed did not fade. The forest seemed to lean closer, the wind whispered his name, and when he returned to his rented room, sleep was a battleground of dreams in which shadowy figures moved through corridors of timber and fog, manipulating events just beyond perception. What Blackwood would not realize until later was that his presence had already disturbed a delicate equilibrium, that Y Hollow had been designed to operate in secrecy, and his intrusion had set in motion events the sisters could not entirely contain, triggering a cascade of subtle forces, legal, social, psychological, that would close in on him as he pursued the truth, demonstrating that the Walker sisters' dominion was not merely physical, but temporal, structural, and cerebral, a form of control perfected over generations that ensured any curiosity approaching their domain would either be absorbed into their system or quietly broken, leaving only fear, respect, and the sense that the mountains themselves had judged him, The night after Blackwood's initial visit, a storm rolled through Y Hollow as if summoned by the ridge itself, lightning splitting the sky and rain hammering the cabin's tin roof with relentless force. And inside, the three sisters sat in tense silence around the kitchen table, the oil lamp casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to stretch and twist toward the corners of the room, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. Louisa's hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles whitened, while Hetty's eyes darted toward the staircase leading to the upper rooms, measuring every creak and groan of the cabin under the assault of wind. And Martha, the youngest, moved methodically to check the placement of the dolls on the mantel, whispering a soft litany of warnings to each one, as though their wooden bodies could absorb and contain the storm's growing fury. Outside, the storm intensified, but the wind and thunder seemed selective, striking only areas beyond the cabin as though delineating the sisters' domain from the rest of the hollow. The nearby trees bent but did not fall. The creek swelled yet remained contained, and the air was alive with a presence that seemed to watch Blackwood from his hiding among the undergrowth, waiting, judging, reminding him that he had stepped into a world that obeyed rules he could not yet perceive. Deep in the forest, hidden from any casual observer, faint footprints appeared overnight, circling the cabin and vanishing into the darkened woods, a warning that the sisters' vigilance extended far beyond walls and windows, and that any intrusion, even one as innocent as Blackwood's pursuit of folklore, activated a chain of subtle, inexorable responses. Within the cabin, whispers of past transgressions rose from memory, the loss of sisters, the vanishings, the broken promises, all catalogued in the movements and gestures of the women, their ritual acting as both protection and judgment. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the hollow eerily quiet, but the atmosphere inside the cabin remained charged, an invisible tension binding the sisters together and radiating outward into the hollow, and when Blackwood dared to peek through the window, he glimpsed only three elderly women, calm, precise, and terrifyingly certain, moving through a domain where time, space, and human curiosity were not merely observed. They were controlled, disciplined, and, if necessary, punished with a subtlety that left no evidence beyond a lingering sense of dread. In the days that followed the storm, Y Hollow seemed to pulse with a hidden rhythm, as though the land itself had absorbed Blackwood's intrusion and was now orchestrating a series of subtle, almost imperceptible consequences. Neighbors reported strange occurrences that they barely dared to speak of, tools vanishing from barns only to reappear in fields hours later, livestock acting skittishly as if sensing unseen eyes, and the air heavy with a tension that pressed against the chest without warning. Inside the cabin, the sisters' routines intensified, each action meticulous and deliberate. Louisa inspecting the perimeter of the homestead at first light, Hetty arranging herbs and charms in precise patterns along window sills and door frames, Martha tending the dolls on the mantel with almost ritualistic devotion, whispering not only to them, but seemingly into the very air, addressing forces that Blackwood could not perceive, forces that now hummed in response to his presence. That same week, Blackwood, unaware of the psychological net tightening around him, noticed subtle changes in the people of Cade County. The general storekeeper, once friendly and talkative, avoided his gaze, conversations hushed when he entered, and even children who had ventured near the Walker property shrank back, as if sensing a warning he could not see. On the ridge, faint symbols began to appear along the trails, carved into tree bark, etched into stones, each a sign, a boundary, a silent communication of power that outsiders were never meant to interpret. The Walker sisters moved among them with the assurance of those who had inherited knowledge that blurred the line between superstition and control, understanding that fear, when cultivated with precision, could guide, bend, and even erase human behavior without ever raising a hand. By the end of the week, Blackwood himself felt the effects, see-wound. Uddle at first, dizziness, a sense of being watched, dreams filled with indistinct figures whispering warnings, but escalating into moments of paralyzing doubt and unease as he tried to write in his journal, only to find words slipping away, narratives unraveling as if the hollow itself rejected his attempts to expose its truths. The Walker sisters had not needed to confront him directly. Their power was preemptive, anticipatory, a psychological architecture designed to shape reality itself, to enforce compliance, and to remind any intruder that in Y Hollow, the mountains, the winds, and the very soil were instruments of discipline, ensuring that every act, every curiosity, and every human intent was carefully measured against a standard, older, colder, and far more exacting than any law or social norm, and those who failed to heed it, even scholars like Blackwood, would come to understand that silence was not merely expected, it was survival. It was during Blackwood's third visit that the true weight of the Walker sisters' dominion began to press upon him, a realization that would haunt every step he took thereafter. The cabin, so orderly and benign from a distance, concealed layers of control and ritual that he had only glimpsed before, subtle gestures that now revealed a terrifying logic, a map of influence stretching across decades, whispered oaths, and unbroken silences. The dolls on the mantel, previously dismissed as quaint heirlooms, suddenly appeared as instruments of memory and warning, each carved figure a placeholder for a sister lost or erased, each tiny garment imbued with a significance that no casual observer could understand, representing acts of control, suppression, and the enforcement of promises that had dictated the lives and deaths of those who came before. Blackwood noticed scratches along the floorboards, seemingly random, yet aligning with the positions of the dolls, forming a pattern he could not decipher. Doors that were once open now creaked closed without wind, shadows moving in ways that contradicted the sun's position, and the air itself felt dense, thick with a tension that seemed to bend both thought and perception. When he asked Louisa about the spring house, her reaction was immediate, icy and precise, an almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw, a glare that conveyed decades of consequences behind a single refusal, a warning that the smallest act of curiosity could unravel more than he was prepared to witness. Outside, the forest seemed to respond, the wind whispering through leaves in unnatural cadences, the creek murmuring along hidden channels as if carrying messages from the mountains themselves, and Blackwood could not shake the sense that the hollow had eyes and ears far beyond his comprehension. Each night, as he tried to process what he had observed, dreams, in true, dead, visions of vanished sisters, secret graves, and the repeated admonition, "Tell no one," a phrase that seemed to echo from the dolls, the cabin, and the very land, cementing a dread that the Walker sisters' power was not merely local or temporal, it was systemic, insidious, and absolute. In that moment, Blackwood understood the gravity of his intrusion. He was not merely documenting folklore. He had trespassed into a living archive of control, a labyrinth of human obedience and fear, a network that demanded compliance, manipulated memory, and enforced silence with the precision of generations, and the knowledge that he carried could shatter both his perception and the fragile equilibrium the sisters had maintained for decades, a balance now trembling at the edge of exposure. It was during the nights following his third visit that Blackwood began to witness phenomena that defied rational explanation, moments so subtle yet so profound that they gnawed at the edges of his reason. Shadows shifted in the corners of the cabin as if alive, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and decayed leaves, and the dolls on the mantel seemed to have been repositioned, their small heads turned ever so slightly, as though watching him with deliberate intent. Louisa, Haidee, and Martha moved through the cabin with a grace and precision that suggested rehearsed choreography, but the repetition of gestures, the touching of windowsills, the muttered incantations over herbs, the methodical alignment of chairs and utensils hinted at a system far older and more exacting than any folk tradition, one that blended fear, memory, and ritual into a single, oppressive force. At night, Blackwood could hear murmurs not from the sisters themselves, but from the walls, floorboards, and even the wind outside, voices speaking in low, urgent tones that seemed to echo events long past, disappearances, whispered promises, and threats that had been executed decades earlier, their consequences still vibrating in the hollow like a suppressed chord that demanded recognition. When he attempted to take notes, he found his pen trembling in his hand, words smudging and distorting on the page, as though the act of recording itself was being resisted by some unseen will. Even the air felt controlled, heavy with charged intent, pressing down upon him, shaping his thoughts, bending his will toward caution, submission, and observation without intrusion. By the fourth night, he noticed that the once familiar paths he had walked to the cabin seemed altered, trails diverging subtly, trees appearing in locations they had not been before, creating a disorienting sense that the hollow itself had shifted. In response to his presence, testing his awareness, manipulating his perception, and asserting dominance without a single spoken word. Blackwood began to understand that the Walker sisters' power was not just psychological, not merely a matter of secrecy or isolation. It was an architecture of control that extended to the land, the air, and the very mind of any who dared to enter, and that each small curiosity he entertained was being catalogued, assessed, and, if necessary, redirected by forces he could not see, shaping a reality in which the distinction between observer and participant, between scholar and subject, was irrevocably blurred. It was on a rainy morning that Blackwood stumbled upon the first tangible evidence of the Walker sisters' calculated orchestration, a discovery that would leave him questioning not only what he knew of the family, but the very fabric of Wye Hollow itself. While examining the edge of the creek behind the cabin, he noticed small, deliberate markings carved into stones, almost imperceptible at first, forming symbols that repeated with precise regularity, each cluster corresponding to a doll on the mantel, and each symbol carrying an unnerving resonance, as though it were a code linking the physical landscape to the sisters' ritual life. The soil bore impressions, footprints that were not quite human, too elongated, too narrow, and yet impossibly measured, circling the cabin in silent, deliberate patrols, a physical manifestation of vigilance and control that seemed designed to mark both space and time, an invisible architecture of fear that had been carefully maintained for decades. When he dared to approach the spring house, long barred to outsiders, he noticed signs of recent activity, tiny fragments of cloth matching the colors of the doll's garments, herbs scattered with the precision of a surgeon, and a faint, sweet scent that lingered in the damp air, a fragrance that seemed at once natural and impossible, signaling that some presence had been there very recently, despite the storm and the supposed solitude of the sisters. Blackwood's notes grew frantic as he began to piece together the layers of secrecy. Each disappearance, each death recorded in hushed whispers or sealed documents, seemed intertwined with the dolls, the carvings, and the rituals, forming a network of cause and effect meticulously maintained to enforce obedience, suppress knowledge, and perpetuate the sisters' dominion over the hollow. Even the natural world, the wind, the rain, the trees, the creek, appeared to participate in the control, guiding behavior, shaping perception, and testing the boundaries of intrusion. Blackwood began to understand that Wye Hollow itself was a living instrument of the Walker sisters' power, a domain where fear, memory, and ritual converged into an invisible system of surveillance and correction, and that any attempt to reveal the truth would be met not with overt resistance, but with subtle psychological manipulation capable of bending the mind, erasing certainty, and ensuring compliance. As he documented his findings, a creeping realization settled over him. This was not folklore, not superstition, not a quaint tale of isolated women. It was a masterclass in systemic control, perfected over generations, where each act, each omission, and each secret had been engineered to maintain dominion over both the living and the memory of the dead, and anyone who dared to trespass, even with scholarly intent, became both participant and observer in a network that demanded obedience through fear, ritual, and psychological dominance. The first direct encounter with the sisters' psychological manipulation struck Blackwood one evening as he lingered near the cabin's back porch, notebook in hand, attempting to make sense of the carvings and the dolls, when Louisa appeared almost silently behind him, her presence so sudden and precise that he had no time to react. Her eyes held a depth of calculation that pressed into his mind, as if measuring not only his intent but the exact limits of his curiosity, and in that moment he felt a strange compulsion to lower his pen, to obey without question, a pull so subtle yet so commanding that it bypassed reason entirely. Louisa spoke only a few words, her voice soft yet unyielding, instructing him to leave the dolls undisturbed, to respect the boundaries of the land, and to understand that every question he asked carried consequences far beyond what he could imagine. And as he nodded, he felt the weight of decades of obedience, secrecy, and ritual descend upon him, pressing the lessons of Why Hollow into his very psyche. That night, sleep eluded him. Dreams intruded in vivid, terrifying sequences, visions of sisters long dead, of graves unmarked, of the missing Thomas Rayburn, and of the dolls moving of their own accord, whispering names, recounting failures, and enforcing promises through fear that transcended time. Each morning, the hollow seemed subtly altered. Trails shifted, shadows bent in impossible ways, and the air carried a quiet, almost imperceptible admonishment that reminded him his intrusion had been noted, measured, and judged. Over the following days, Blackwood realized that observation alone had made him complicit. His presence had triggered a sequence of enforcement that the sisters orchestrated with the precision of military strategy, a network of psychological control that extended into his mind, shaping thoughts, eliciting doubt, and creating a persistent underlying terror that made him question whether he was witnessing events as they happened or participating in a reality that had already been scripted for him. Every detail, from the positioning of the dolls to the carved symbols, the whispers of the wind, the subtle rearrangements of the cabin, all operated as instruments of authority and influence, and Blackwood understood that he was no longer an objective observer. He was part of a system that demanded recognition, obedience, and ultimately silence. And the true horror lay in knowing that the Walker sisters' dominion was not limited to their home or the hollow, but extended into the very minds of those who dared to uncover the past, ensuring that the knowledge he had gained carried with it an inescapable living weight. It was during his meticulous review of the county records and whispered accounts from elderly townsfolk that Blackwood first traced the chilling connection between the missing Walker sisters and the inexplicable disappearances that had haunted Wye Hollow for decades, a pattern so precise it could only have been orchestrated by someone or something who understood both human nature and the isolating geography of the mountains. Buried within faded documents and carefully edited newspaper clippings were gaps, absences, and inconsistencies that defied coincidence. Each name erased or misdirected, every death or disappearance cloaked in bureaucratic ambiguity, and Blackwood began to perceive the invisible threads tying these events together, threads that led unerringly back to the 6 sisters who had lived, ruled, and controlled the hollow with an almost surgical attention to secrecy. He discovered that Thomas Rayburn was not an isolated incident, but one among a series of vanishings timed and executed with such precision that law enforcement, neighbors, and even family members were complicit, willingly or unwittingly, in maintaining the facade of normalcy, each omission reinforcing the system of fear and obedience the sisters had built. Cross-referencing the old land deeds, death certificates, and personal diaries revealed a network of control that transcended mere survival or isolation. It was psychological engineering embedded in every decision, every interaction, and every document, ensuring that no outsider could ever fully comprehend or disrupt the legacy the sisters maintained. Even Blackwood's own presence seemed anticipated, as though the hollow itself had prearranged his intrusion to observe how the system responded, testing his curiosity, his ethical limits, and his willingness to accept the unseen rules imposed by generations of calculated isolation. With every disco, the weight of the Walker sisters' power grew heavier, revealing not just cruelty or eccentricity, but a deliberate mastery of manipulation that extended from tangible control through hidden graves, strategically placed dolls, and altered terrain to intangible dominance over perception, memory, and narrative, a dominion that made outsiders participants in their silent experiment, whether they realized it or not. The pattern was undeniable. Those who strayed too close to the truth vanished, were redirected, or were forced into compliance, and Blackwood recognized with a growing visceral dread that his own investigations had already altered his reality, bending him to the rhythms of Wye Hollow, its shadows, and its unseen enforcers, until the boundary between scholar and subject had dissolved entirely, leaving him immersed in a system of control older and more precise than any law or folklore he had ever known. Blackwood's first direct encounter with a ritual that revealed the sisters' absolute control over both the living and the memory of the dead came one storm-lashed night when curiosity drew him close to the cabin's upper floor, where shadows pooled like liquid, and faint candlelight flickered beneath the cracks of the wooden floorboards. Through a narrow window, he watched Louisa, Hetty, and Martha arrange the dolls in a precise semicircle around a small, unmarked mound of soil, murmuring in low, deliberate tones that seemed to bend the very air, each syllable carrying weight, authority, and something more, an unseen force that Blackwood could feel pressing against his chest, tightening his breath, sharpening every nerve. The dolls were not mere playthings. They were vessels, conduits for memory, will, and perhaps even essence, each one corresponding to a sister lost or a secret buried, and as the women placed tiny, meticulously crafted objects into the doll's hands, a lock of hair, a folded scrap of paper, a trace of ash, the atmosphere thickened, vibrating with purpose and history, a silent edict demanding acknowledgement and obedience. Blackwood could hear the wind outside echoing their cadence, the storm punctuating their ritual with thunder like applause and lightning like judgment, and he realized that the sisters were not only preserving the past, they were actively rewriting it, asserting dominion over what could be remembered, forgotten, or erased entirely, controlling both narrative and consequence with surgical precision. Every movement, every whispered command, and every glance between the women carried layers of meaning, and Blackwood felt the weight of centuries of knowledge, fear, and enforcement pressing down on him, a subtle psychological leverage that warned him without words that his presence, while tolerated, had consequences he had not yet begun to understand. The ritual ended as abruptly as it had begun. The dolls were returned to the mantel, each exactly where it had started, the mound of soil smoothed, the candles extinguished, and the sisters retreated into shadow, leaving Blackwood frozen, heart pounding, mind whirling, and senses sharpened to the unsettling realization that Wye Hollow was alive, sentient, and ruled not by law or legend, but by an unbroken chain of ritualized authority, a network in which the line between memory, manipulation, and mortality had been blurred beyond recognition, and where any outsider who trespassed, even with noble intent, was immediately absorbed into a system that measured, observed, and disciplined with a quiet, unyielding precision. In the following days, Blackwood began to piece together the psychological mechanisms the Walker sisters had employed for decades, a system so refined that it bordered on the scientific. Every story, every disappearance, every whispered warning in the hollow was part of a larger framework designed to instill obedience, cultivate fear, and maintain absolute secrecy. And he realized that the sisters had mastered a form of behavioral conditioning that transcended generations. They understood, with a terrifying clarity, the vulnerabilities of the human mind, how children could be molded by stories whispered at twilight, how adults could be coerced by implied threats, and how the memory of death itself could enforce compliance without the need for overt violence. The dolls on the mantel were central to this system, not simple tokens but psychological anchors that tied memory to ritual, ensuring that the living remembered what was safe to know and what must be forgotten, and that each generation internalized the rules through subtle cues, inherited anxiety, and unspoken oaths. Even Blackwood, an educated man trained to observe objectively, felt the insidious effects of this conditioning. He began noticing patterns in his own thoughts, compulsions to record only what was safe, and an uneasy certainty that any deviation would trigger consequences he could neither predict nor fully comprehend. Interviews with locals, long silenced by fear and respect, revealed that the hollow itself had been shaped to reinforce these behaviors, paths that twisted unexpectedly, hidden vantage points, and even the placement of livestock, all orchestrated to remind residents of their place within the sisters' system. Blackwood's journals grew heavier, filled with meticulous notes that documented not only what he saw, but how he felt under the subtle influence of the hollow, a creeping awareness too. Had the sisters' power extended beyond physical presence and into cognition itself, bending attention, memory, and perception to their will. He began to see the legacy of the missing sisters, the unrecorded deaths, and the disappearances not as random tragedies, but as calculated lessons, part of a continuous strategy to maintain dominance, protect secrets, and ensure that no matter who intruded, who watched, or who listened, the rules of Waihollow would remain intact, enforced with an invisible hand that operated through fear, ritual, and the quiet, unyielding authority of women who had learned that the greatest control is exerted not through force, but through the mind itself. Blackwood's first direct confrontation with the Walker sisters' enforcement of loyalty came unexpectedly one evening as he lingered near the cabin's edge, attempting to reconcile the psychological patterns he had observed with the physical reality of Waihollow. Without warning, Louisa appeared from the shadows, her presence as precise and silent as a predator's, and spoke with a voice that carried both authority and a subtle, insinuating threat, reminding him that curiosity alone was not neutral. It was a choice, a decision with consequences measured in silence, isolation, and the subtle erosion of one's own will. She reminded him of Thomas Rayburn, of Caroline, and of the sisters who had vanished from the hollow, reciting details that no outsider could know unless they had been woven into the fabric of obedience or had trespassed too deeply into forbidden knowledge. Blackwood felt the weight of generations of secrecy press against his chest. Every instinct screamed to retreat, to respect the invisible boundaries he had already crossed, and yet a part of him, trained to seek truth, resisted, creating a tension that seemed to vibrate in the very air of the hollow. Louisa's eyes held a calculating patience, measuring not only his reactions but his potential for compliance, and as she stepped closer, the storm outside amplified the intensity, lightning illuminating her gaunt features, wind rattling the cabin, and the sound of rain on the roof like a drumbeat of judgment. She did not touch him, did not raise her voice beyond the low, deliberate cadence of her words, and yet the effect was total. Blackwood felt himself constrained, ensnared in a system he barely understood, his mind bending to the invisible rules enforced by ritual, legacy, and an unspoken covenant of silence. That night, as he scribbled in his journal, he realized that Waihollow was not merely a place, but an instrument, a mechanism designed to recruit, test, and ultimately control anyone who sought to expose its truths, and that his presence alone had already altered the delicate balance the sisters had maintained for decades. From that moment forward, every observation, every question, and every movement was fraught with danger, for he had crossed an invisible line, and the sisters' dominion over mind, memory, and narrative was now a tangible force pressing him toward choices that would define not only what he discovered, but who he had become under the suffocating gravity of their control. As Blackwood continued his investigation, he began to uncover chilling evidence that the Walker sisters had not only mastered control within the hollow, but had for decades manipulated outsiders with the same precision they exercised over their own family, a revelation that blurred the line between folklore and calculated strategy. Through careful cross-referencing of old letters, journals, and testimonies from those who had dared approach Hollow in previous decades, he realized that travelers, researchers, and even law enforcement had been subtly guided, misled, or quietly coerced into compliance, their memories reshaped and their curiosity redirected before they could expose the Hollow's secrets. The sisters understood human psychology in a way that seemed almost unnatural. They created controlled narratives, planted misleading clues, and maintained a constant network of observation that extended beyond the visible boundaries of their property, ensuring that every intrusion was accounted for, measured, and neutralized without leaving overt traces of violence. Blackwood discovered that missing hunters, wandering folklorists, and even local children who had strayed too close had become part of a silent, decades-long experiment in obedience and fear, their experiences carefully contained within the Hollow's ecosystem of secrecy. Each encounter left behind subtle psychological markers, a lingering dread, a memory that shifted, a story told differently, so that anyone who ventured too near the truth would be subtly reminded of the consequences of overstepping. By analyzing these patterns, Blackwood realized the sisters' influence was cumulative, creating generations of residents and visitors who unconsciously reinforced the system, obeyed unspoken rules, and perpetuated silence. Even he, with all his education and skepticism, could feel the Hollow's authority creeping into his decisions, shaping how he recorded his findings, how he approached the cabin, and how he interacted with locals. It became undeniable. The Walker sisters' dominion was not just physical, not just ritualistic. It was systemic, psychological, and deeply woven into the very fabric of Hollow and its surroundings. He understood then that exposing their secrets was not merely a matter of documentation. It was a dangerous act of defiance against a living mechanism of control that had been perfected over decades, one that judged every thought, every hesitation, and every step with relentless precision, and that his own survival depended on learning the rules without breaking them, even as he edged closer to truths that could unmake everything he thought he knew about the mountains, the sisters, and the very nature of power itself. In the days that followed, Blackwood's attention turned to a more subtle, almost invisible layer of control, a network of symbols, marks, and messages the Walker sisters had woven into the landscape, the cabin, and even the lives of those who entered Hollow, a hidden language that only those initiated into their knowledge, or those daring enough to study it, could begin to decipher. Etched into fence posts, carved into tree bark, and subtly embroidered into quilts and clothing, these symbols carried instructions, warnings, and historical records, a coded system that chronicled the disappearances, rituals, and movements of both family members and intruders over decades. Blackwood began to notice repetitions, specific patterns in the placement of objects, the direction in which paths curved, and the alignment of the dolls on the mantel, all of which corresponded to events or directives long forgotten by the uninitiated. Locals, when pressed about seemingly trivial details, would often hesitate, glance nervously at one another, and change the subject, an unconscious acknowledgement that the symbols were more than mere decoration. They were the sisters' quiet enforcement, a form of communication that transcended speech, a living ledger that both guided and restrained the actions of anyone who interacted with the Hollow. Blackwood realized that the dolls themselves, the objects placed within the springhouse, and even the orientation of farm tools were all part of a layered system of messaging, a psychological web designed to reinforce obedience, preserve secrecy, and ensure that the sisters' dominion was both persistent and invisible. It became increasingly clear that every coincidence he had observed, the unexplained disappearances, the avoidance of certain paths, the sudden reluctance of townsfolk to speak, was in fact deliberate, part of an enduring strategy to mold perception and behavior. By mapping these symbols, Blackwood began to see the outline of a centuries-old framework of control, a system so meticulously maintained that it felt almost alive, capable of responding to intrusion and adjusting in real time to safeguard Hollow's secrets. The weight of realization hit him with a physical force. He was no longer merely an observer. He had stepped into a matrix of influence that measured his attention, manipulated his fears, and quietly dictated his possibilities, and he understood with chilling clarity that any misstep, any lapse in perception, could trigger consequences designed to erase not only his understanding of the Hollow, but perhaps even his sense of self, leaving him a captive of a system that had perfected the art of psychological dominion long before he ever arrived. Blackwood's investigation soon led him to the most unsettling revelation yet. The Walker sisters had cultivated a deliberate, unspoken influence over local law enforcement, a manipulation so precise and subtle that it had remained hidden in plain sight for decades, effectively turning the sheriff's office into a silent enforcer of their will without a single overt command. As he pored over decades-old records, private correspondence, and oral accounts, he found a pattern in which monthly visits by Sheriff Delmore were transformed from routine check-ins into instruments of control, ensuring the sisters' compliance while also signaling to the community that the Hollow was under constant watch, a paradoxical blend of surveillance and protection. Every report of missing persons, unexplained disturbances, or suspicious activity was handled in a manner that maintained the illusion of normalcy, while simultaneously reinforcing the boundaries the sisters had established, their influence extending into the interpretation of evidence, the issuance of death certificates, and the timing of public announcements. Blackwood discovered notes indicating that judges and other officials were briefed privately, reminded to avoid probing too deeply, and subtly guided to accept surface explanations without question, a practice that ensured that decades of disappearances, strange deaths, and odd occurrences never reached the historical record. Even when tragedies like Thomas Rayburn's disappearance occurred, the law was not absent, but carefully curated, maintaining both the appearance of legitimacy and the functional enforcement of the sisters' hidden agenda. As he traced these interactions, Blackwood began to see a terrifying reality. The Walker sisters were not merely recluses or folk practitioners. They were architects of a regional system of control, capable of bending both social and legal structures to preserve secrecy, manipulate behavior, and maintain a perfect equilibrium in Hollow. Every official who encountered them, knowingly or unknowingly, became a participant in this system, their authority co-opted, their discretion subtly redirected, until the Hollow itself operated as a self-sustaining machine of obedience, fear, and secrecy. By the time Blackwood finished cross-referencing the records, he understood that the sisters' power had never relied solely on folklore, threats, or isolation. It was institutional, psychological, and profoundly enduring, capable of shaping human behavior across generations, and he felt the unmistakable weight of this realization pressing on him. The deeper he delved, the more he understood that Hollow's dominion was not merely a relic of the past, but a living force that could touch anyone who dared to uncover it. Blackwood's next breakthrough came when he traced the first unbroken lineage of the Walker sisters' rituals, revealing practices that had been transmitted silently from generation to generation, a continuum of psychological and ceremonial mastery so precise it was almost surgical in its execution. Through fragments of diaries, coded letters, and whispered oral histories from those brave or foolish enough to speak, he discovered that the sisters' activities were not random superstition, but deliberate methods designed to channel fear, obedience, and loyalty, reinforcing the Hollow's control over both family and outsiders alike. He found that each sister was trained from childhood to recognize patterns in human behavior, to manipulate perception through gestures, timing, and narrative, and to record every event that might disrupt their system, ensuring that any potential breach of secrecy could be anticipated and neutralized before it gained momentum. The rituals themselves, involving dolls, miniature effigies, and precise arrangements of objects within the cabin and surrounding land were more than symbolic. They were practical tools of influence, each placement and invocation tied to behavioral outcomes, responses, and deterrence. Blackwood began mapping these practices alongside historical events, noting correlations between ritual actions and the timing of disappearances, illnesses, and subtle shifts in local conduct. And the picture that emerged was horrifyingly coherent. The Walker sisters had constructed a self-perpetuating web of control that reached into every corner of Y Hollow, blending tradition, fear, and strategy into a living, adaptive system. Even the townspeople who had interacted with them decades before, folklorists, midwives, sheriffs, had been influenced without realizing, subtly guided into patterns that reinforced the sisters' dominion and erased potential threats. Blackwood realized that his own presence was now part of this lineage. His observations, questions, and recorded notes were being assimilated into a system that could interpret, anticipate, and manipulate his next move. He felt the weight of their psychological architecture pressing against his mind, an invisible force shaping his choices even as he documented it. And he understood with chilling clarity that he was no longer merely an investigator, but a participant, a living example of the Hollow's reach, and that to survive the descent into Y Hollow's history, he would need to navigate not only facts, but the very currents of influence the sisters had honed over decades of disciplined secrecy. As Blackwood's research deepened, he began uncovering evidence that the Walker sisters had extended their influence far beyond their cabin, orchestrating a deliberate, almost invisible system of community indoctrination that had persisted for decades, shaping the behaviors, beliefs, and fears of every person in Y Hollow and the surrounding valleys. He discovered that local children were subtly taught to respect, fear, or avoid certain paths, animals, and landmarks, their early experiences carefully guided to reinforce a hierarchy the sisters controlled, while adults were conditioned through stories, warnings, and cryptic advice to accept the sisters' authority without question. Blackwood traced patterns in town folklore, noting that tales of hauntings, curses, and strange occurrences often coincided with moments when the sisters' dominion was threatened, or when an outsider drew too close to their secrets, and he realized that these stories were not merely passed down for entertainment. They were a tactical tool, a means of encoding obedience into the collective consciousness. Through interviews with elderly residents, he pieced together accounts of unusual rituals during storms, instructions about where to walk, what to say, and how to respond to certain signs, all of which pointed to a subtle, long-term program of psychological conditioning designed to preserve Y Hollow's hidden order. He began to see the town itself as a living instrument, shaped over generations to support the sisters' control, where law, social norms, and even communal rituals were quietly aligned with the Hollow's secret rules. Every interaction, every anecdote, every suppression of inconvenient truths now appeared orchestrated, evidence of an enduring structure of influence that blurred the lines between tradition, coercion, and fear. Blackwood understood with growing dread that he had stumbled into a carefully maintained ecosystem of control, one that had not only survived decades of scrutiny, but had perfected the art of invisibility, bending both perception and memory to its will. He realized that exposure could destabilize the system, and that the sisters, though elderly and seemingly frail, wielded a power far beyond the obvious, a psychological authority that could manipulate entire communities and ensure that their secrets remained unchallenged, invisible, and horrifyingly effective. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became. Y Hollow was not simply a remote valley, it was a meticulously engineered theater of dominance, and he had unwittingly become its latest audience, its latest instrument, and perhaps its next victim. It was in the subtle inconsistencies that Blackwood began to notice the first cracks in the sisters' decades-long control over Y Hollow, small lapses that suggested even the most disciplined psychological system could not remain flawless forever. Whispers of discontent surfaced among townsfolk who had grown too old to remember the original edicts, young families who questioned long-held superstitions, and outsiders whose mere curiosity threatened to unravel the carefully constructed illusions. Blackwood began documenting instances where routine patterns were disrupted, paths previously avoided suddenly crossed, children defying warnings, and subtle challenges to the authority of the sisters that had once gone unquestioned. He observed that certain community members had begun to act independently, their behavior no longer aligning perfectly with the encoded instructions embedded in folklore, rituals, and daily routines, and he realized that time itself, with its natural erosion of memory and obedience, was undermining the sisters' power. Even the dolls on the mantel, once meticulously arranged to maintain symbolic dominance, appeared to show signs of irregularity, perhaps a reflection of the diminishing control over the psychological environment the sisters had maintained for so long. Blackwood noticed the tension this created within the cabin. Louisa's normally precise movements were more abrupt. Head's words carried sharper undertones, and Martha's hands trembled slightly while performing tasks that had once been effortless, signs of a system struggling against entropy. The delicate balance between secrecy, fear, and obedience had begun to falter, and with each small fracture, the potential for exposure grew exponentially. Blackwood understood the significance immediately. He was no longer just an observer or chronicler. He was a catalyst, an external force subtly accelerating the erosion of centuries of control. With each question he posed, each note he wrote, each visit he made, the invisible threads that bound Hollow together were stretching thin, and the sisters, despite their mastery of manipulation, were forced into a defensive posture, revealing cracks that could, if pressed, expose the full extent of their power, their hidden rituals, and the terrible events that had been meticulously hidden from history. It was in this tension, between the fragile authority of the sisters and the growing anomalies of the community, that Blackwood sensed both opportunity and danger. The Hollow was on the brink of revelation, and he was standing at the epicenter where curiosity and mortality collided. Blackwood's persistence finally led him to the final, horrifying truths behind the Walker sisters' ultimate acts of psychological and ritualistic dominance, revelations that forced him to confront the sheer depth of their orchestration and the moral abyss at the heart of Hollow. Through a combination of previously ignored court records, fragmented diaries, and testimonies from those who had dared to cross boundaries, he realized that the sisters had not only maintained control over the living, but had constructed elaborate posthumous rituals designed to extend their influence even after death, binding the community, the land, and their own legacy into a continuous cycle of obedience and fear. The dolls, he discovered, were not mere memorials. They were instruments, vessels containing intentions, curses, and directives encoded with knowledge only the sisters fully understood, designed to manipulate perception and behavior through proximity, ritual engagement, and subtle psychological cues. Blackwood uncovered patterns of disappearances and misfortunes spanning decades that were not random accidents but carefully timed and executed lessons, reinforcing the Hollow's hierarchy, punishing curiosity, and ensuring compliance. Even deaths that appeared natural, like those of Carolyn, Polly, and Nancy, were entwined with these rituals, their timing, burial, and symbolic placement serving as anchors in a system of living influence, a network that could affect memory, belief, and decision-making across generations. Blackwood felt the oppressive weight of this realization pressing on him. The Walker sisters had not simply survived. They had transcended the limitations of ordinary life, creating a psychological infrastructure that could perpetuate fear, loyalty, and secrecy long after their physical bodies had decayed. The implications were staggering. He now understood that Hollow was less a place than a mechanism, engineered with deliberate precision, where human behavior was monitored, guided, and corrected in ways invisible to outsiders, yet devastatingly effective. As he traced the invisible lines connecting ritual, authority, and consequence, he recognized that his own presence had been integrated into this network. that every step, question, and recording was being absorbed into a system designed to predict, manipulate, and, if necessary, punish. The Hollow's dominion, he realized with chilling clarity, was absolute, a living testament to the sisters' mastery over both mind and tradition, and any attempt to expose it would require confronting not just history, but the very architecture of control they had built, a structure as impenetrable as it was horrifying, leaving Blackwood to wonder if any outsider had ever truly left Y Hollow unchanged. The psychological horror of Y Hollow began to manifest directly in Blackwood's life, creeping into his perception of reality in ways that were subtle at first, but grew rapidly into a suffocating, undeniable presence. He started noticing patterns in the townspeople's behaviors that no longer seemed coincidental. The same glances, the way conversations would halt abruptly when he entered a room, the slight tremor in the hands of those who once appeared composed, all as if the Hollow itself were observing and responding to him. At night, the shadows of his rented room seemed to lengthen unnaturally, stretching across walls and floors with a deliberate awareness, and whispers of voices, indistinct, layered, almost chant-like, reached his ears when the wind rustled through the valley, leaving him questioning whether he was witnessing supernatural phenomena or the heightened effects of his own paranoia amplified by the sisters' meticulously cultivated aura of fear. Even his dreams became vectors of influence. Images of the cabin, the dolls, and the long-forgotten sisters replayed with precise variations, each scenario loaded with symbolic weight, teaching, punishing, or warning him. And he began to notice that his thoughts, once independent, were subtly guided toward paths the Hollow seemed to anticipate and approve. The boundary between observation and participation blurred. Blackwood realized he was no longer documenting history. He had become part of it, a node in the network of control, and the Hollow's mechanisms of influence extended far beyond physical presence, reaching into cognition itself. Every decision he made, every note he wrote, every question he asked, seemed preempted and counterbalanced by unseen forces, and the realization left him feeling both exhilarated and terrified, understanding that the Walker sisters had constructed not just a family legacy, but a psychological dominion that could ensnare the minds of even the most rational and determined outsiders. By the time he returned to the cabin for his final interviews, Blackwood sensed that Y Hollow had claimed him in a way no mere folklore, document, or local legend could capture. He was now a living testament to the Hollow's reach, and the deeper he probed, the more he understood that some knowledge, once glimpsed, could never be unlearned, and that the Walker sisters' dark mastery over fear, ritual, and obedience was as alive and potent in the 1960s as it had been in the shadows of the 1930s, ready to manipulate, punish, and transform anyone who dared enter their world unprepared. Blackwood's investigations culminated in the discovery of the most tangible and sinister evidence of the Walker sisters' long-hidden acts, a truth that would shatter any notion of ordinary folklore or isolated eccentricity, for buried in the unmarked, unconsecrated grounds behind the cabin, he uncovered a sequence of shallow graves, each carefully hidden beneath layers of leaves, earth, and ritual symbols that only the sisters could have conceived. The soil, disturbed yet meticulously disguised, bore the marks of precise, repeated effort, indicating a pattern of concealment and devotion to a code older and darker than any record he had previously examined. Within these graves, he found remnants of carefully bound objects, decayed fabrics, and fragments of the dolls he had observed on the mantel, now revealed to be part of a complex system of sympathetic magic, where personal items, likenesses, and symbolic gestures had been used to anchor influence, punishment, and memory into the living landscape of Y Hollow. As he documented the scene, Blackwood realized the gravity of what these sisters had engineered. They had created a lattice of control that extended beyond life and death, where ritual, geography, and the psychological manipulation of every nearby resident converged into a singular, terrifying structure of authority. The skeletal evidence confirmed suspicions raised by decades of oral histories, newspaper omissions, and carefully redacted records. Disappearances, sudden deaths, and unexplained misfortunes had been deliberately orchestrated, each one reinforcing obedience, secrecy, and fear in the surviving community. The dolls, the graves, the ritual placements, they were all interwoven into a system that ensured the Walker sisters' dominion persisted, not through brute force, but through subtlety, invisibility, and psychological saturation, a mastery of human perception and social conditioning that few could recognize, and even fewer could oppose. Standing among the hollowed earth, Blackwood felt the full weight of the sisters' legacy pressing upon him, the sense that he, too, could be claimed if he misstepped or revealed too much. The entire valley, the cabins, the trees, and the stories were part of a living, breathing apparatus of control, a mechanism so precise that it had endured for decades, shaping human behavior as surely as the mountains themselves shaped the weather. The realization was suffocating. The Walker sisters had achieved immortality not through memory alone, but through an unbroken, insidious system of influence that bound the minds of the living to the unspoken edicts of the dead. And Blackwood understood in that moment that he was standing at the epicenter of a power that had been hidden in plain sight, untouchable, and profoundly dangerous. The final confrontation with Why Hollow's truths came not in a dramatic clash, but in the suffocating realization that the Walker sisters' dominion was absolute, a force embedded in the very bones of the valley, in its winding paths, in the conditioned minds of its residents, and now, terrifyingly, in Blackwood himself. As he stepped carefully across the cabin floor one last time, he could feel the weight of generations pressing down, a silent, calculated awareness that measured his intentions, scrutinized his curiosity, and gauged his compliance. Every object in the room, the dolls, the worn furniture, the fire-warmed hearth, was a node in a network of psychological control, each one silently transmitting lessons, warnings, and authority across decades, across space, and across minds. Blackwood sensed that the sisters, though physically frail, remained omnipresent, their influence radiating outward like a living echo, shaping perception and guiding thought in ways that had become second nature to the local population. Even the sheriff, the judge, and the townsfolk who appeared independent were unknowingly complicit, their actions and judgments subtly influenced by rituals and behaviors instilled long before they were aware of it. As he pieced together the final sequences of disappearances, deaths, and manipulations, a chilling clarity emerged. Why Hollow was not merely a home, a family legacy, or a story. It was a psychological fortress, a temporal prison designed to perpetuate control, secrecy, and fear beyond the lifespan of any single human. Blackwood felt the cumulative pressure of the sisters' system pressing into him, testing his resolve, tempting him to retreat, to ignore what he had seen, to preserve his mind from the corrosive weight of forbidden knowledge. And yet, he also recognized that stepping away would not free him. The Hollow had already claimed a part of him, embedding fragments of ritual, observation, and fear into his own cognition, ensuring that even his memories, dreams, and instincts were now subtly guided by the sisters' design. It was in that harrowing moment, standing in the threshold between revelation and madness, that Blackwood understood the true depth of Why Hollow's power. The Walker sisters had transcended mortality, becoming architects of influence, masters of perception, and keepers of a system so complete, so insidious, that it had remained hidden in plain sight for decades. And now, even as an outsider, he was a thread in their intricate, unbreakable web. Blackwood left Why Hollow physically unharmed, but the psychological imprint of the Walker sisters followed him relentlessly, embedding itself in every corner of his perception and gnawing at the edges of his consciousness like a shadow that refused to dissipate. Even miles away, the patterns of control, ritual, and influence he had witnessed replayed in his mind, weaving themselves into his thoughts, dreams, and decisions with the precision of a masterfully designed trap. He began noticing subtle signs everywhere, strangers who seemed to follow his routines, coincidences that felt orchestrated, and recurring symbols in newspapers, architecture, and even casual conversation that mirrored the hidden codes he had seen in Hollow, forcing him to question whether the Hollow's dominion ended with the mountains or extended far beyond, infiltrating minds, towns, and systems he had once believed separate from the sisters' influence. Blackwood's sleep became fragmented, punctuated by visions of the cabin, the dolls, and the graves, each dream carrying the weight of unspoken commands, rituals, and unfulfilled obligations. He realized that the sisters' true power was not rooted in physical dominance or violence, but in their ability to embed themselves into consciousness itself, to manipulate perception, memory, and behavior so thoroughly that even those who left the Hollow carried pieces of it with them, unknowingly perpetuating its reach. The more he tried to document, rationalize, or distance himself, the more entwined he became, recognizing that Hollow was not merely a location or a legend, it was a living system, one that had anticipated his intrusion and subtly co-opted his awareness from the moment he arrived. And as he wrote his notes, spoke with colleagues, and revisited records, he understood that exposure carried a cost. Anyone who uncovered the full depth of the etched Ister's methods risked the same entanglement, the same psychic tether to a legacy that did not end with death, a control that seeped through time, space, and mind. The Walker sisters had constructed not just a story, but an enduring, invisible architecture of influence, and Blackwood now knew he would forever carry the echo of Hollow, a haunting reminder that some knowledge, once glimpsed, can never be unlearned, and that true mastery of the mind can be wielded by those who understand fear, ritual, and secrecy in ways most living humans cannot imagine. The final revelation of Hollow descended upon Blackwood like a cold, suffocating wind, stripping away the last illusions that separated him from the Walker sisters' enduring dominion. As he pieced together decades of omissions, manipulations, and orchestrated tragedies, he understood that what the public had called folklore, superstition, or eccentricity was in fact a meticulously maintained system of control, a legacy designed to manipulate perception, memory, and even morality across generations. Every disappearance, every sudden death, every whispered warning among townsfolk had been calibrated to reinforce obedience, fear, and silence, creating a lattice of influence so precise that outsiders who dared to investigate became unwitting participants in the sisters' architecture of domination. The dolls, the graves, the secret rituals, they were not mere artifacts, but instruments of a psychological machine designed to anchor terror and respect into the very souls of those who observed or trespassed, ensuring that Hollow's power persisted far beyond the lives of the women who had initially conceived it. Blackwood felt the full weight of this knowledge pressing against him, an invisible hand weaving itself into his thoughts, compelling him to remember, to obey, and to protect the secret even as he struggled with the moral imperative to expose it. And yet, in that unbearable clarity, he recognized the truth that would haunt him forever. The Walker sisters had achieved a form of immortality not through fame, bloodline, or legend, but through mastery of fear, ritual, and psychological control, embedding themselves into the consciousness of the living in ways that no law, record, or revelation could undo. Hollow was alive, and in its silence, its shadows, and its meticulously maintained boundaries, it taught a lesson as terrifying as it was precise. Some knowledge changes a man permanently, and the act of knowing, of truly seeing the mechanisms of control, binds him to them inseparably, irrevocably. Blackwood left the valley with his mind sharpened, haunted, and forever altered, carrying the weight of forbidden truths that no one outside those mountains could ever fully comprehend. And the audience, should they listen closely and heed the warning, realizes that the history buried in Why Hollow is not just a story to be told, it is a cautionary testament to the terrifying, enduring power of human cunning, secrecy, and the dark mastery of the mind.